Hello and welcome to another Plane Truce, and today we're going to be talking about pilot incapacitation. Joining me today is the legend that is Captain Al. Hi, Captain Al.
Hi, Matt. How are you doing?
Yes, I'm good, thank you. Yes, I survived another week, as they say.
Absolutely.
That's all we can do.
You and me both.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all we can do at the moment. Now, I'm going to say that the phrase to you here, what happens if the pilot ate the fish? So really I want to know, in the event of an incident, what happens basically if either the captain or the co-pilot, the first officer, is taken ill. What are the procedures involved in that? I mean, presumably there's two people in the cockpit for a reason.
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. So we'll just play the end titles and away we go.
Right.
No, there's a little bit more to it than that. Two pilots as a minimum, to largely mitigate the effects that you've just talked about, which is one of the pilots becoming incapacitated. Now, as it so happens, people tend to think about things like heart attacks, which are obviously pretty serious. Let's not belittle that. But it's actually food poisoning is the most common cause for incapacitation. And it's not a myth. We do eat separate meals. So for airlines that provide catering, you will be provided some form of menu or selection, and the two pilots, or three pilots if there are more than two, occasionally there are four, but we'll keep it simple, the pilots will choose individual meals, so there'll be very little crossover. Now, it may be that one pilot might have the chicken curry and one pilot might have roast chicken, but those food production lines are entirely separate and will almost certainly be made on different days, maybe in different facilities. So if we have a pilot who becomes incapacitated, then assuming that they are still alive, that pilot will take no further part in the operation of the flight. They may well remove themselves from the flight deck, or if necessary, be removed, and the other pilot will take over. Now, it's probably fair to say that aircraft of a large size, a bit like the one behind me, if you're viewing this on YouTube, are designed for two-pilot operation, but it's perfectly safe for one pilot to operate the aircraft. And indeed, it's something that we practice as part of our recurrent sim checks. So the important thing to realize is that there's always going to be at least two pilots available. And we take a lot of measures to prevent pilots from becoming ill. So I've talked a little bit about food preparation. There are also guidelines to pilots with regards to, say, for example, not eating shellfish prior to a duty. We all know that shellfish can be a little bit dodgy in certain times of the year. If they're not kept well, if they're fresh, or indeed if they're not managed well, if they're frozen. So high-risk foods we attempt to eliminate before duties. Generally speaking, most airlines encourage their staff to eat the airline prepared food, so try to avoid the catering facilities in the airport, and to try to have a fairly good food hygiene whilst on board. We do occasionally have, unfortunately, pilots who become incapacitated due to medical conditions, like a heart attack. So, of course, the cabin crew will deal with trying to preserve life. And as I said, two pilots, one perfectly capable of operating the aeroplane on their own.
So in that instance, say somebody has been incapacitated, would then, let's say, for example, it's the captain, so it's the captain that's been taken poorly, the first officer obviously now assumes command of the vessel, for want of a better word, would they need to stay where they are and stay in the right seat, or would they need to move into the captain's seat?
That's a really, really good question. They would stay where they are, because it would be akin to someone who drives a vehicle with right-hand drive, suddenly just throwing themselves into the other seat and trying to work out exactly where everything is. So when we are checked by the airline in the sim, most of us will be checked in our chosen seat. So captain will be in the left, co-pilot in the right. So no, there's no seat shuffling if a pilot becomes incapacitated. Stay where you are.
So the other question, and the reason why I suppose I'm asking that is because I know obviously at our 200 we were very lucky that we all went to go and have a go in the 737, didn't we, over in Putney there. Now, one of the things I do remember from sitting in the captain's seat to be, the one in charge, is there was a certain little wheel that you had to use in order to steer the vehicle once it was on the tarmac. So, I mean, what would happen there?
Okay, so on Boeings, as the 737 is, you can have a tiller for steering the aeroplane when it's on the ground. On both sides of the cockpit, if you pay extra. On the Airbus product, it comes as standard. So, okay. So if you're traveling on a Boeing and the captain becomes incapacitated, probably what will happen is the aircraft will land, either stay on the runway or just vacate the runway onto the taxiway, because we do have a degree of nose wheel steering with our feet, but it's only a small amount. And then basically the airplane would be brought to a halt, and a tug would then be required to tow the aircraft to its final parking position. On an Airbus, the co-pilot has the technical capability to control the aeroplane, to taxi the aeroplane on the ground. Some airlines, however, don't have their first officers taxi, so it kind of a bit of an insurance aspect. So some airlines allow their first officers to taxi the aeroplane normally and under abnormal circumstances. Some airlines will say you can only taxi under extreme circumstances, and others will say, okay, no, you just don't taxi the aeroplane. So many years ago when I worked for Monarch Airlines, there was one such event where the captain became incapacitated. It wasn't food poisoning, it wasn't a heart attack, it was some sort of viral event, and he felt pretty unwell, so he actually relieved himself of duty. He walked out of the flight deck with some assistance, sat in row 1, and the first officer did a fantastic job, and he landed the aircraft and just brought the aircraft to a halt on the runway, shut the engines down, and they towed the aeroplane off the runway, and claps all round. And the captain was taken off to hospital, spent a couple of nights there, and made a full recovery.
Wow. So, I mean, obviously, I have to ask the question here. I mean, I presume these are very rare events. I mean, this is perhaps not that some first officers and captains perhaps don't experience in their entire career a situation where they end up in charge of the aircraft on their own.
Absolutely. I think I've got just around about 14,000 hours of flying now, and I have experienced incapacitation once, where I had a first officer who about an hour before landing said, look, I just don't feel very well. I'll be okay. So I said, okay, well, I'll speak to you again in about 10 minutes. Just, take a break. See how you feel in 10 minutes. In 10 minutes down the line, he said, I just don't feel well. I said, okay, no problems. So he just, push your seat back, take your headset off, and, I'll deal with it from here. Obviously, we've got the cabin crew to look at him. He just had a bug, shall we say. It wasn't full-on food poisoning, but he was a bit clammy, just didn't feel quite right. So, no, they're not very common events at all. So that's, if I'm flying out, so that's one event in 20 years, and typically I fly more often than the average person.
So, obviously from a nervous flyer's point of view, which is what these segments are all about, essentially, it is, as you say, perfectly safe for the first officer or the captain to be in charge of, for example, an A320 on their own.
Absolutely. I think the key thing to take away is the fact that you have 2 or more pilots.
Right.
So from a licensing point of view, we are the same. Typically, the captain will just have more experience. So any of the pilots who are operating pilots have the ability and capability to land the aeroplane on their own.
Captain L, thank you.